19-year-old Marcus Bennett entered the courtroom with the swagger of someone walking into a party, not a trial that would determine the rest of his life. He grinned at the bailiffs, nodded to spectators like a celebrity acknowledging fans, and slumped into his chair with casual indifference. His eyes constantly scanned the room, not with fear, but with amusement, as if the entire proceeding was an elaborate joke designed for his entertainment. He had been caught, arrested, and charged with armed carjacking and aggravated assault, but in his mind, none of it was real. He was 19 after all, just a kid. The system would go easy on him, it always did. But what Marcus Bennett didn't understand, what his arrogance wouldn't allow him to see, was that the victim sitting across the courtroom wasn't just another name on a police report. She was a woman whose life he had irreparably shattered, and her testimony would be the key that locked him away forever. The night of March 8th descended upon the parking garage of Mercy General Hospital, with the quiet that comes in those liminal hours between late shift changes. Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old pediatric nurse, was finishing what had been a brutal 14-hour shift. She had spent her day caring for critically ill children, comforting terrified parents, and administering treatments with the precision and compassion that had defined her decade-long career. She was exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled, her feet aching, but her mind was already shifting to home, to her own 2 children waiting with her husband, to the promise of a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again. She walked through the dim garage toward her modest sedan, her keys already in hand, her thoughts on the mundane details of her evening routine. She had no reason to be afraid. This was a hospital parking garage, a place of healing, of safety. How wrong that assumption would prove to be. Marcus Bennett had been circling the garage for nearly an hour, his eyes scanning for the perfect target. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't broke. This wasn't about survival or necessity. It was about the thrill, the rush of power that came from taking what wasn't his, from exerting control over someone weaker. He had carjacked 3 vehicles in the past 2 months, each time walking away clean, each time more emboldened by his perceived invincibility. He was young, fast, and in his mind untouchable. The police hadn't caught him yet, and he was certain they never would. When he saw Sarah Mitchell walking alone, tired and distracted toward her car, he saw not a human being, not a dedicated healthcare worker, not a mother of 2, but an opportunity, a mark, easy prey. The attack was swift and brutal. As Sarah reached her car, Marcus emerged from behind a concrete pillar, a stolen handgun pointed directly at her face. The suddenness of it, the jarring transition from mundane routine to mortal terror, sent her into immediate shock. Her keys clattered to the ground. He didn't speak gently or try to calm her. Instead, he screamed at her, his voice echoing through the empty garage, a torrent of profanity and threats designed to intimidate and dominate. When Sarah, frozen in fear, didn't move fast enough for his liking, he grabbed her by the hair and threw her violently to the ground, her body hitting the concrete with a sickening thud. He took her keys, her purse, her sense of safety, and drove away in her car, leaving her bleeding and sobbing on the cold garage floor. Her world forever altered. The 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m., Sarah's voice barely coherent through her panic and tears. Hospital security found her within minutes, still on the ground, unable to stand, her body trembling with shock. The physical injuries were cataloged by the ER staff she worked alongside. A concussion, a fractured wrist from breaking her fall, lacerations on her hands and knees, bruises that would fade with time. But the invisible wounds, the psychological trauma that burrowed deep into her psyche, those would prove far more devastating and enduring. Within hours of the carjacking, she began experiencing severe panic attacks. The thought of leaving her home, of walking through any parking area, of being alone in any space sent her into spirals of terror. Sleep became impossible without the intrusion of nightmares. Her hands would shake uncontrollably at unexpected sounds. The woman who had spent years in high-pressure pediatric emergencies, calmly saving children's lives, could no longer function. in the world Marcus Bennett had thrown her into with such casual cruelty. The investigation was surprisingly swift. Marcus had made a critical error, born of his own narcissism and stupidity. After dumping Sarah's car in a neighboring county, he had posted photos and videos on his social media accounts, showing off the items he had stolen from her purse, her credit cards, her hospital ID badge, even a family photo he mockingly held up to the camera while laughing. He had tagged his location, bragged about his come-up, and created a digital trail so obvious that detectives barely needed to investigate. Within 72 hours, Marcus Bennett was identified, located, and arrested without incident at his grandmother's apartment, where he had been living rent-free while terrorizing the community. When officers arrived, he was asleep, surrounded by the evidence of his crime, utterly confident that he had gotten away with it. During his initial interrogation, Marcus treated the detectives like inconveniences, not authorities. He leaned back in his chair, smirked at their questions, and provided a series of obviously rehearsed lies that fell apart under even the most basic scrutiny. He claimed he found the car abandoned, that he didn't know whose purse it was, that the woman must be confused or lying. His arrogance was so profound, his sense of entitlement so deeply ingrained, that he genuinely seemed to believe he could talk his way out of overwhelming evidence. When confronted with his own social media posts, he shrugged and said, "That ain't me in the video." The detectives exchanged glances. They had seen hundreds of criminals, but rarely one so delusionally confident in his own intelligence while simultaneously proving himself to be profoundly stupid. The case was handed to the district attorney's office, where prosecutor Janet Reeves took one look at the evidence and knew this would be straightforward from a legal standpoint, but deeply important from a human one. She reached out to Sarah Mitchell to discuss the trial, and what she found was a woman utterly broken by trauma. Sarah explained, her voice hollow, that she had been forced to take a leave of absence from her job. She couldn't return to the hospital, couldn't walk through that parking garage, couldn't focus on her young patients without experiencing debilitating flashbacks. Her children asked why Mommy was always crying, why she jumped at every sound, why she wouldn't leave the house. Her marriage was strained under the weight of her PTSD. The life she had built through years of dedication and hard work had been obliterated in 90 seconds by a stranger who wanted her car for a joyride. Reeves promised Sarah that she would make sure Marcus Bennett understood the full weight of what he had done, even if it took putting Sarah's suffering on full display in open court. Marcus's court-appointed attorney, David Chen, was a competent public defender drowning in an impossible caseload. He reviewed Marcus's case with growing frustration. The evidence was overwhelming: video footage, social media confessions, physical evidence, eyewitness identification. There was no viable defense, no technicality to exploit, no angle that would result in acquittal. His only hope was to negotiate a plea deal, to convince Marcus to show remorse and accept responsibility in exchange for a reduced sentence. But every time Chen met with his client, he was met with the same cocky indifference, the same delusional confidence that this was all going to blow over. Marcus refused to accept any deal. He wanted his day in court. He wanted to perform. He genuinely believed he would walk free. The trial began on a cold November morning. The courtroom was full, not with supporters for Marcus, but with members of the nursing community who had come to stand with Sarah Mitchell. They wore their scrubs in solidarity, a sea of compassionate faces there to witness justice for one of their own. Marcus noticed them and seemed amused, whispering to his attorney and chuckling. He was dressed in an ill-fitting suit, his attempt at looking respectable undermined by the smirk that never left his face and the casual posture that screamed disrespect. Judge Helen Morrison, a stern woman with 25 years on the bench, watched him carefully from the moment he entered, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp and assessing. The jury was seated after 2 days of selection: 8 women, 4 men, a cross-section of the community that included parents, retirees, a teacher, and a mechanic. They looked at Marcus with curiosity more than judgment at first, But that would change. Prosecutor Reeves delivered her opening statement with controlled passion, painting a vivid picture of Sarah Mitchell's life before and after the carjacking. Describing the terror of the attack and the devastating aftermath, she promised the jury that they would see the evidence, hear from the victim herself, and understand that this was not a mistake or a moment of poor judgment, but a predatory act, committed by someone who viewed other human beings as objects to be exploited for his own amusement. Chen's opening for the defense was measured and realistic. He didn't deny Marcus's guilt. He couldn't. But he tried to frame it as the impulsive act of a young man with poor judgment, not a hardened criminal. He asked the jury to consider Marcus's youth, his troubled background, and to show mercy. It was a professional effort, but it lacked conviction, because even Chen knew that the young man sitting next to him had shown no mercy to Sarah Mitchell and expected none in return. Throughout both opening statements, Marcus sat with a bored expression, occasionally doodling on a notepad, once even stifling a yawn that several jurors noticed. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Detective Rodriguez testified about the social media evidence, showing the jury Marcus's own videos bragging about the stolen items. A forensic expert confirmed Marcus's fingerprints throughout Sarah's vehicle. The hospital security footage was played, showing Sarah walking to her car moments before the attack, and then the grainy but unmistakable image of Marcus speeding out of the garage in her vehicle. Each piece of evidence was a nail in his coffin, but Marcus seemed unbothered, even amused. He whispered comments to his attorney, earning several warning glances from Judge Morrison. Then came Sarah Mitchell's testimony. She walked to the witness stand slowly, her hands trembling visibly, her face pale. She had to pause several times to compose herself as she described the attack in painful detail. The gun in her face, the terror that froze her body, the moment he grabbed her hair and threw her to the ground, the sound of her car speeding away while she lay bleeding. She testified about the aftermath, about the nightmares, the panic attacks, about having to leave the job she loved because she could no longer function. She described watching her young daughter ask, "Mommy, why are you scared all the time?" and not having an answer that wouldn't terrify the child further. The courtroom was utterly silent, except for Sarah's quiet, choked testimony and the sound of several jurors sniffling back tears. The nurses in the gallery held hands, some openly crying for their colleague. It was raw, devastating human testimony that laid bare the true cost of Marcus's thrill. And throughout all of it, Marcus Bennett sat at the defense table with a faint, inappropriate smile on his face. Not a nervous smile, not an embarrassed grimace, but a genuine expression of amusement. He drew little cartoons on his notepad. He looked around the courtroom as if waiting for something interesting to happen. When Sarah described hitting the concrete and the pain of her wrist breaking, he actually giggled, a quiet sound, but several people heard it, including 2 jurors who immediately looked at him with expressions of disbelief and disgust. Chen leaned over and whispered urgently to Marcus, but the young man just shrugged and went back to his doodling. Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening, but she allowed the testimony to continue. When Reeves finished her direct examination and returned to her seat, she didn't look at Marcus. She didn't need to. His own behavior was proving her case better than any words she could offer. The cross-examination was brief. Chen had no real questions for Sarah. What could he ask that wouldn't make things worse? But he gently inquired about her medical treatment and recovery, trying to establish some semblance of normalcy and to remind the jury that Sarah was getting help. It was a kind gesture, but it did nothing to mitigate the damage of what they had already heard and seen. When Sarah was finally excused, she didn't look at Marcus as she walked past the defense table. But he looked at her and the smirk widened just slightly. A final act of cruelty that did not go unnoticed. The defense had little to offer. Chen called a social worker who testified about Marcus's difficult childhood. An absent father, a mother struggling with addiction, instability, and poverty. He called a former teacher who said Marcus had been a bright student when he applied himself. It was all meant to humanize him, to provide context, but it rang hollow. Plenty of people had difficult childhoods and didn't terrorize others at gunpoint. The prosecution's cross-examination was swift and effective. establishing that Marcus had also had opportunities, programs, support, people who tried to help, that he had rejected in favor of criminal behavior. Marcus did not testify in his own defense. Chen wisely kept him off the stand, knowing his arrogance would only seal his fate. But he didn't need to testify. His behavior throughout the trial had already told the jury everything they needed to know about his character. The closing arguments were powerful on the prosecution side and perfunctory on the defense. Reeves reminded the jury of Sarah's broken life, of the gun pointed at her face, of the defendant's complete lack of remorse evidenced by his courtroom behavior. Chen asked for mercy, for consideration of youth and background, but his heart wasn't in it. Even he had grown disgusted with his client. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, their faces were set and serious. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict with a clear, firm voice. Guilty on all counts: armed carjacking, aggravated assault, possession of a stolen vehicle. Marcus's smirk finally faltered, just slightly. A flicker of something that might have been the first stirring of concern, but it was quickly replaced by his default expression of cocky indifference. He still didn't believe the world could truly touch him. He still thought his youth would save him. 2 weeks later, the courtroom reconvened for sentencing. This was the moment when Sarah Mitchell would deliver her victim impact statement, and when Judge Morrison would determine Marcus Bennett's fate. Sarah stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges to steady herself, and spoke directly to Marcus for the first time. Her voice was stronger now, fortified by anger and the cathartic power of finally being heard. She told him exactly what he had taken from her. Not just her car, not just her sense of safety, but her career, her peace of mind, her ability to be the mother and wife she wanted to be. "You looked at me and saw nothing," she said, her voice breaking. "Just an object, a thing to be used and discarded. But I am a person. I am a mother. I am a nurse who dedicated my life to saving children. And you destroyed me for a car you ditched 2 days later." As she spoke, as this broken woman poured her heart out, Marcus Bennett did something that would define his fate. He smiled. Not a nervous tic, not an uncomfortable reaction, but a genuine, amused smile. He even glanced at the gallery as if to share the joke. Sarah saw it, her voice faltering for just a moment before rage propelled her forward. "You think this is funny?" she said, her voice rising. "You think my suffering is funny?" Judge Morrison's gavel came down hard, but the damage was done. The entire courtroom had seen it. The mask had never been on. This was who Marcus Bennett truly was. A young man utterly devoid of empathy, incapable of understanding the pain he caused, viewing the entire world as his personal playground. Judge Morrison asked Marcus if he had anything to say before sentencing. Marcus stood, and in a final display of staggering arrogance, he said, "Yeah, I'm sorry and all that. I'm young though, you know. I made a mistake. People deserve second chances." His tone was casual, almost bored, as if he were reciting lines from a script he didn't believe in. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't express any genuine understanding of what he had done. It was a performance, and a bad one at that. Judge Morrison let the silence stretch after Marcus sat back down. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold steel, cutting through the courtroom with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "Mr. Bennett," she began, "I have presided over hundreds of criminal cases in my years on this bench. I have seen genuine remorse. I have seen young people make catastrophic mistakes and show true understanding of the harm they caused. I have extended mercy when mercy was warranted." She paused, her eyes boring into him. "You are not one of those people," she continued, her voice rising with controlled fury. "Throughout this entire trial, you have shown nothing but contempt. Contempt for the victim whose life you shattered. Contempt for this court. Contempt for the very concept of justice. You smiled while Ms. Mitchell described her terror. You giggled while she wept. You treated the suffering you caused as entertainment." The courtroom was absolutely silent, every person hanging on her words. Your attorney spoke of your youth, of your difficult background, and asked this court for mercy. But mercy is earned through remorse, through acknowledgement of wrongdoing, through a genuine desire to make amends. You have shown none of those things. You have shown us exactly who you are, a predator who views other human beings as objects for your amusement. Judge Morrison then addressed the law, explaining the sentencing guidelines for armed carjacking. The base sentence was significant, but there were enhancements available for particularly egregious circumstances. "The state has requested that I apply gang enhancement penalties," she said, "based on evidence that you committed this crime in association with known gang members, that this was part of a pattern of criminal activity, and that you used fear and intimidation in a manner consistent with gang violence." Marcus's smile vanished. Suddenly, the math was adding up in his head, and the numbers were no longer in his favor. Chen had warned him about the gang enhancement. It could multiply his sentence significantly, but Marcus had dismissed it, certain it wouldn't apply to him. Now, as Judge Morrison methodically explained how the enhancement met every legal requirement based on the evidence presented, including his own social media posts showing gang affiliations, his face went pale, the swagger evaporated. His hands, which had been so casually doodling throughout the trial, now gripped the table. "For the crime of armed carjacking," Judge Morrison declared, her voice ringing with finality, "I sentence you to 15 years in state prison. With the gang enhancement, that sentence is increased to 25 years. For the aggravated assault, an additional 5 years to be served consecutively. Total sentence, 30 years in the Department of Corrections with no possibility of parole for the first 25 years. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. 30 years. 25 years before parole. He would be nearly 50 years old before he even had a chance at freedom. The blood drained from his face. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. For the first time in the entire proceedings, Marcus Bennett understood that actions had consequences, that the world was not his playground, that he was not untouchable. The realization crashed over him like a tsunami, drowning the arrogance, the swagger, the smirk, leaving behind only raw animal panic. As the bailiffs moved in to take him away, Marcus's composure completely shattered. He turned to look at his attorney, his eyes wild with terror and disbelief. No, wait," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I'm only 19. I'm just a kid. You can't." But the bailiffs were already cuffing his hands behind his back, their faces impassive, unmoved by his sudden panic. He twisted around, trying to make eye contact with the judge, with his attorney, with anyone who might save him from the reality he had spent weeks ignoring. "Please, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry," he shouted, his voice rising to a desperate wail. But the words rang hollow, a last-ditch performance from an actor who had finally realized the show was over. Sarah Mitchell watched from the front row, her face a mixture of satisfaction and lingering pain. The sentence wouldn't heal her trauma, wouldn't give her back the life she had lost. But it was something. It was the world finally acknowledging that what he did mattered, that she mattered. The nurses around her squeezed her hands, some of them crying, all of them grateful that their colleague had received some measure of justice. As the courtroom doors closed behind Marcus Bennett, sealing him away from the free world he had taken for granted, his cries echoed down the hallway, the desperate, broken sounds of someone who had finally, devastatingly, learned that the world does not revolve around him, that cruelty has costs, and that the shield of youth he had hidden behind was nothing but an illusion. Judge Morrison remained seated, watching the empty doorway, her face impassive but her eyes reflecting a grim satisfaction. Justice, cold and absolute, had been served. The laughing carjacker would laugh no more.